Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today on Connect and Collab. Thank you so much for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate. Today we're bringing you our special series, Finding Colorado's Next Governor. The Colorado Business Roundtable is proud to partner with the Denver Business Journal to bring you in-depth interviews with Colorado's gubernatorial candidates. I'm Tammy Schaefer, your on-air producer, along with Jeff Wasden, president of the Colorado Business Roundtable.
How are you, Tammy? It's good to be back.
Glad to have you. And Ed Seelover of the Denver Business Journal.
Thanks.
Hi, Ed.
Thanks again for having me on, Tammy.
Make sure you tune in to Connect and Collaborate on the last business day of each month to hear from all of the candidates. We want you to join in as well. If you have a question you'd like to ask each candidate, tag us on Twitter at ColoradoBRT, hashtag FindingColoradoGov, and we'll use your question in our interview. And today we are going to interview a candidate, Mike Johnston, Democratic candidate for governor. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mike, it's great having you. We've had an incredible opportunity over the course of probably 5 months, I'm going to say, give or take, to really interview a diverse group of candidates. We'll leave it at that. Some very different views on how to...
The list is that long. It took you 5 months to get through it.
Well, there's still more coming, but we're excited to get a chance to chat with you. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I will repeat this ad nauseum forever. I love the passion and the folks that really are stepping up to serve. I think that's part of what makes this state great. We may come at problems and issues and opportunities from different viewpoints and ideologies, but we get a chance to share that. That's really the whole point of this series, is to start to get to know the candidates with our great partners at the DBJ. So with that, let's just jump right in and really kind of get an opportunity, Mike, for you to share a little bit about who Mike Johnston is and what got you interested in running for governor.
You bet. Thank you all so much for having me in today, and look forward to the conversation. I've listened to some of the other ones and great conversations, so excited to jump in. Yeah, so I grew up on the western slope of Colorado. I think I may be the only candidate who grew up on the western slope of Colorado, but my family moved out there in the 60s and 70s. My dad had a bar out there for a while, and then my parents opened a bed and breakfast in the 70s, and our family's been running it ever since. So my brother and I and my mom still run it to this day, 43 years and going. But I eventually went into the real family business in our family, which was teaching. I'm a fourth generation public school teacher, and so started my career teaching in the Mississippi Delta, teaching high school English down there in one of the poorest counties in America, and loved it, but missed home, and so came back to Colorado and started my work as a school principal. And so I was a principal of a couple of different high schools. I ran one in Denver that served all students who lived in state custody. I ran a school in a juvenile prison in Arapahoe County for a while. Then I spent 4 years as the principal of a high school up in Adams County in Thornton. And that was really what got me into politics in the first place, and that I was running the school and really enjoyed it, and we'd worked really hard to take a school that had about a 50% dropout rate, and after years of hard work turned it into the first public high school where 100% of our seniors both graduated from high school and were all admitted to four-year colleges, and that seemed like a great success until we found out that a bunch of our students were undocumented, had come to this country when they were 2 or 3 or 4 years old. And even though they were admitted to college, couldn't go without paying out-of-state tuition, which was just impossible for them. And so it was really looking at half the kids on my stage at graduation, realizing they couldn't pursue the dreams they were interested in, that convinced me to run for the state senate the first time. And so I've been in the state senate the last 7 years. I've loved it, and I think I'm in a place now when we look out at what's happening in the rest of the country. I like to think that Colorado is still a place really of pragmatic problem solvers who like to get things done, and there are a set of, I think, big challenges facing the state over the next decade that I'm sure we'll talk about today, everything from economic development to education to transportation and infrastructure that I think the state needs to solve. And I think more than that, I think that Colorado has a chance to prove to the rest of the country that it's possible that democracy still works, that good people can come together from opposite sides and still solve problems. And so I think that's what inspires me to do this, is I want to be a part of making an impact on the state and solving the problems that are out there, and I want to show to my kids and to the people in the rest of the country that actually Colorado is the place you should watch if you want to see how people still build things and get things done.
So when people talk to you about your time in the state legislature, what do you point to as what you would say were your proudest moments, your signature accomplishments? How do you view your 7 years?
Yeah, there are, I would say there are a couple that I'm most proud of that are emblematic of, I think, the way that I tried to solve problems. So one was a I was the sponsor of the Jumpstart legislation, which was an economic development proposal for rural counties across the state. And we saw, and many of you, Jeff, you knew about this and were involved, but we saw there really were two Colorados. You had a lot of economic development in the Front Range. You had rural areas that were still struggling. And that was one where we had some Republicans from Grand Junction who were pushing it, and they couldn't find any Democrats to support it. And I thought it was a great idea. I jumped in early, and we worked hard to make it a bipartisan piece of legislation that's been very successful. In the last year alone in Grand Junction, 7 new businesses opened, almost 200 new jobs created. And so I think I'm very proud of the places where I've been able to work across the aisle and solve real problems for folks that we got things done around. So Jumpstart's one of them. Obviously, I think our work on, we eventually pushed and passed this bill, the asset bill, which allowed the undocumented students at my high school and around the state to get access to college training. Did that in a bipartisan way. And so I think, and then there was a lot of work I did on things like criminal justice reform, whether it was getting felony DUI passed, which had failed 8 or 10 times. I think my story in the legislature was one where there were a lot of issues where people were just stuck, where you had people who had been fighting for a long, long time and couldn't get what seemed like common sense solutions done. And I think the thing I'm most proud of are the times that I was able to build those coalitions where you could find people to work together to make an impact, whether it was economic development or whether it was education or whether it was energy or criminal justice.
You've got a great reputation at the Capitol of your 7 years there as a state senator, Mike, and I think that pragmatic, thoughtful, willing to work together to build coalitions has served you well. One of the things that you got involved in heavily is really being the lead proponent on an education initiative. And while we'll get into education later in the show, you traveled the state. You went down into Douglas County, not once, not twice, 3 different times, and were viewed very differently by the folks down in Douglas. But I want to talk a little about what you learned during that statewide tour and how you're using that to help you reach out as you're running for governor now.
You bet. And this was one where, we looked at the big problem in the state we were trying to solve, which was there's a $1 billion hole in K-12 funding around the state. And we know that hole exists now in transportation and infrastructure as well. And so we tried to solve it at one big bite, which was to try to go to the voters and ask, as Tabor requires, that you would increase taxes to fund that investment. And you're right, I traveled all around the state and talked to people, and it did not get public support. And one of the things I heard from people was, hey, we want to make sure government's using the dollars they have now more effectively. We want to know actually where the current money is going and be more transparent about what results it gets. And, and we want to make sure we can rebuild faith in our current education system before we're willing to invest more. And so what I learned from that defeat was I don't think there's an appetite for a tax increase in the state. I think we got to do more with what we have right now. I think we'll come back to Tabor and others later, I'm sure. But so I went back the next year and said, okay, let's take that feedback and let's act on it. And so we found a way to make the single largest one-year investment in K-12 education we'd made in, in my 7 years there in a bipartisan way by finding parts of the budget we could use to do that. We expanded early childhood coverage, and we made that money far more transparent. So I think that was a place where I learned the lesson that wasn't where voters were, but we didn't think they wanted some of the same things. We found a way to get those things done without a tax increase.
Love that. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. We are talking today with Mike Johnston, Democratic candidate for governor. As we round out our series, Finding Colorado's Next Governor, you're listening to Connect and Collaborate. Stay with us. We'll be back with a lot more. Thanks so much for staying with us today here on Connect and Collaborate. We are bringing you our series, Finding Colorado's Next Governor, and we're here with Jeff Wasden, Colorado Business Roundtable President, and Ed Seelever of the Denver Business Journal. And we're talking with Mike Johnston, a Democratic candidate for governor.
Mike, I want to keep going on that education theme. I know we had a chance to talk about some of the things and lessons learned as far as your tour and coming back to the legislature the next year and getting some things passed. There's some concerns in the business community about the preparation in the state, the graduation rates, the attainment gap, the pathways that we're certainly encouraging students to engage in. And I think a little bit of a disservice as far as the kids coming out that aren't quite ready for the jobs of the future and the change in the agility and the pace of technology and its impact on education. So many people view you as the education candidate in this race. Talk a little bit about what does an education policy look like under a Governor Johnston regime, since clearly we've already anointed you that title so far today.
I'd like to thank Tammy already.
Yeah, I think so. But what are your priorities? What are your focus? What do we need to do to change? And certainly based on your background, not only as Senate, but certainly as a former high school principal.
I think you hit on exactly, Jeff, which is there is a dramatic change coming in the economy over the next 20 years, and that's going to require us to fundamentally change how we look at education and how we look at workforce development, right? The old world 50 years ago was you could look out your window and see a factory down the street, and if you graduated from high school and got a degree, you could get a job there, and you'd start at 21 and retire at 62. And that promise is broken. That doesn't exist anymore. So we got to figure out how do we create an education system for the new economy. And I think that's one where folks are going to change careers 8 to 10 times over the course of their life. They're going to see industries disappear overnight and new ones emerge. And so we have to prepare a workforce system that can reskill and upskill people at all stages of their career, both if you're 18 looking for a first job and if you're 58 looking for your 10th. And so we've come out with this proposal called the Colorado Promise, which would allow people at any stage of their career to identify, okay, here's the skills I have now. If my job's going away, here are the high demand jobs that exist in the state, and here are the skills I need to fill those jobs. So employers are helping tell us what are the actual skills I need employees to have. And then someone could say, okay, if these are the 5 or 6 skills I need training in, where can I get the training to get that? And that the state would help support that training. So these folks would get access to tuition, debt-free to that training, in exchange for providing some meaningful service to the state. So our idea is that nothing's free in Colorado, you got to work for it. But that it would work like a civilian version of the National Guard, where you keep your day job 5 days a week, 10 or 12 weekends a year, you come out and provide service to the state. And that investment in the state helps the state invest in the skills you need to get to the next job. So now you don't have a world where we got to have a holy war every time we're going to debate if an industry is going to go away or not. Industries are going to go away. The more important question is how do we train workers for the industries that are coming? I think if we do that right, it's the best state in the country to run a business, because you know when your industry's got to pivot 180 degrees overnight, you have workers that are trained for it. And it's the best state to be an employee or a student, because you know you can find exactly the skills you need for the jobs that are out there. So I think it takes a real revisioning of how the entire pipeline of education works, which is not going to be from age 5 to 18 anymore. It's going to be something you do over the course of your life in smaller but more continuous segments.
Now, you've been a part of these debates at the Capitol, but where exactly is the role of state government versus the role of the private workplace in this? I mean, at one point, private workplaces trained their employees who were coming on there. I mean, how much does the state need to step in, and how much does it need to step out and let the private market dictate this?
Yeah, so I think what the private market's going to drive is what are the skills they need for the jobs that exist. Right? Only the private sector can tell us that. I think what the state has an obligation to do is how do we better align our state resources, community college, four-year colleges, K-12 institutions, to make people prepared for those jobs. I think it's a partnership between the private sector and the public sector where they're telling us what skills they need, and then we're helping create a marketplace where folks know they can get access to the training that they need to get ready for those jobs. I think a lot of people don't go in for that training because they're not sure there's a job ready at the end. So I think, Ed, one of the places for the state here is to say, we're going to keep and display the data to know of these 8 training programs you're looking at, which one actually has the highest placement rate in jobs, what has the highest retention rate, what's the average salary for those programs. So in the same way you could look at restaurant reviews before you decide where to go. If you're looking at training, the state could say, hey, here's which one of these programs actually place people in jobs and employers say they're ready. I think that kind of information is the kind of thing that the government can help do, but really what we're trying to do is be a better partner to private industry that's growing.
There's a saying, in God we trust, everything else we measure. How do you measure success in education? What does that look like to you? And how do you ensure that we're on the right path? There's different programs, there's different initiatives that are out there. We certainly are putting a big investment into apprenticeships with CareerWise. At what point do we need to start looking at the successes of these programs and determine whether or not they're actually meeting the needs of industry and serving our kids well?
Yeah. I think that's a great example. I think there are some hard measures we know are true, right? When you talked about employers who still are frustrated that they have students coming out who aren't ready to enter the workforce, and often I was talking to an employer this morning who's running a bank who just said, biggest issue I see is a gap in writing skills. Yeah, we run a bank, you still got to be able to write effectively and concisely. So I think there are core skills about literacy and numeracy we can measure and we should measure to know how kids are doing and how schools are doing. I think there's also a bigger set of soft skills, which is, do you know how to work collaboratively, and do you know how to solve problems, and do you know how to take new concepts and make them applicable? And so I think that's true, but I think one of the more important drivers we're going to see now is, do folks find their way into a middle-class job where they can support a family and take care of themselves? Right? I think the ultimate reason why we want education for a lot of people is very practical. It's you want to be able to find a job that you love, that can pay the bills and support your family. And so I think that ought to be our long-term measure still, is how well are these programs doing at placing people into jobs that can support them.
And I'm going to shift on you just a little bit here, because obviously some of the most important people in preparing these students are the teachers. Teachers make up a big percentage of the people in the public employee retirement system right
Yes.
now, which is only $32 billion underfunded. So talk to us about how you balance the need to fund education, as well as some other subjects we're going to talk about, with the need to rebalance that. What would you do to fix para right now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say is, as a public school teacher myself, they're not big signing bonuses or, top salesman trips to Hawaii for public school teachers in this country. And so one of the things that we had as the fundamental promise was there's a strong retirement system. I think folks on both sides want to make sure that retirement system is still in place. And so I chaired the Finance Committee in the Senate for several years, so had the direct oversight over para, and so spent a lot of time on this. I supported the reforms in Senate Bill 1 8 or 9 years ago, which first called us to, yes, require employees to contribute more, employers to contribute more, and the cost of living adjustment to be reduced. I think now we supported the drop in the rate of return expectations. I think now what we're seeing, and the para board has voted that way, is that there is still more effort that's going to be required to make sure that fund is solvent. And I like some of the ideas that the board's come out with, including the idea of automatic adjuster on the cost of living adjustment that would allow you to, we'd love to increase that adjustment in good years financially, but we have to be able to ratchet it back down, because to do 2% a year every year in a world where you might be able to retire at 55 or 60 but live to 95 or 100, the state's got to be mindful about how to make that work. So I think I'm encouraged by some of the proposals coming out of the para board that would say we want to make sure that there is still a retirement fund that is safely protected and available for folks that have worked their whole lives to earn it. And we also want to make sure that fund is solvent, which means you got to be able to make adjustments midstream. What I like about this is it doesn't require a new piece of legislation. Every time you got to adjust the budget for para, it allows it to fluctuate as the markets do.
Well, you've mentioned obviously the para board coming up with some proposals. The governor certainly weighed in, and our current state treasurer and Republican candidate Walker Stapleton has put out a proposal as well. Where do you see the nexus? Where are the commonalities, and where are the areas of concern for you with the different proposals from all three of those entities?
I think the commonalities are everybody wants to make sure that there is a retirement there that people can plan on and budget around, so we don't have a lot more folks in poverty, and so I think that's a common area. I think the fact that there is going to be eventually a top level number at which public districts can't go beyond. Right now, about 20% of the total cost of a school district go to para, and so they want to be able to have enough money to pay people for the work they're doing now, not just for their retirement later. And so I think districts and others are starting to say, and the governor have started to say, we can't just keep escalating that employer contribution infinitely, and so we have to find some controls on those. And I think the biggest opportunity there is how you make sure that you can both meet that promise to people and make sure you have flexibility on the cost of living adjustment. I think that's the most right place for compromise. And I also think, obviously, there is already a choice option for folks who want to do defined contribution versus defined benefit programs. So that choice exists now for people that want to advocate for that. But I think this first step by the board would allow us to shore up the fund for right now, and then you do what we always do, which is you have to watch carefully what the returns generate and what the long-term solvency looks like. And when that solvency gets in jeopardy, you have to make adjustments, which we've done before and taken the hard votes on that. But I think this adjuster on the cost of living would make it easier for us to do that without having to come back to the legislature every 2 years.
So I'm going to shift on you again now, because as long as we're talking about things the state's spending its money on, transportation is obviously a big topic at this point. How did you feel about what the legislature did in its first post-Johnston year last year, putting aside the $1.9 billion, not putting a tax hike to voters? What do you think needs to be done next, if anything, in terms of transportation funding?
It all went in a handbasket once I left the building. It just went downhill. No, I mean, I think transportation and infrastructure are one of the most important problems to solve in the state. And if you saw CU's lead school proposal, study 2 days ago that said they think they're going to start seeing contraction or freezing in the state economy over the next 2 years because we have a shortage of talent to fill the jobs that are out there and a shortage of infrastructure to actually move goods and people across the state. And so there's no doubt this is going to start strangling the state if we don't solve it. So I was obviously disappointed that the legislature didn't refer a measure on transportation. I think that's a problem that is solvable. And I find when you travel all over the state, even if there are folks that disagree on certain social issues, there's pretty broad support for folks who want to be able to have safe roads and bridges. And so I think that's an issue the state has to solve. I was disappointed we didn't get it done through the legislature this year, but I think if it ought to go to the voters directly. And I think one of the things I've committed to as the next governor is that I would lead a ballot measure to make sure we got that done, because I think if you don't invest in infrastructure right now, you're going to have massive losses in the state long term.
Are there, let me jump in, are there places we can cut in the state budget to send more money to transportation?
So what I believe, I've done a lot of work on what we call pay for success legislation, which is how do you make sure that the investments that are made into state services actually generate the results you're after. So I think we spend a lot of time focused too much on the inputs of state government and not on the outputs. And so one example for this is, we did some bipartisan proposals around that would be both early childhood education and recidivism prevention, right? If you look at folks coming out of jail, 50% of them are back in jail in 3 to 5 years. And so that costs the state $200,000. We can save a lot more money by spending $10,000 to get them a job up front and training. So I think there are ways to look at where the state's money goes so it's better used.
Okay, we'll be back with more with Mike Johnston, Democratic governor, or Democratic.
Oh, she's just trying to give you that title.
Stop it. I'm going to edit that. Democratic candidate for governor here on Finding Colorado's Next Governor with Connect and Collaborate. We'll be right back. Thanks again for staying with us today on Connect and Collaborate as we bring you Finding Colorado's Next Governor. Today we are talking with Mike Johnston, a Democratic candidate for governor.
Hey, Mike, before we leave transportation, I want to talk a little bit about a comment you made before the break as far as helping lead the charge to fix this transportation issue that is so an economic imperative, certainly for business, for quality of life, for safety issues. What does a ballot measure look like? Are you talking about bonding? Are we talking about sales tax? Are you looking at some kind of hybrid with SOT, with potential for rental car and lodging taxes? Talk a little bit about your idea of the right proposal to lead or carry.
Yeah. I think the coalition here is also transportation and other parts of what I would call infrastructure, which is human infrastructure, right? Which is how do you, the other part that the CU Leads study was saying was talent. How do we have the people prepared for the programs we need? So I think this is about linking actually an education proposal and a transportation proposal and doing them together. As you know, over the last couple of years, there's been dueling battles over who goes to the ballot when and who wins and who doesn't, and then people fight in their own sort of sandboxes. So I would propose that you'd go to the ballot and you would go to voters and ask them to make changes to Tabor, which would allow you to, you'd keep the provision of Tabor that everyone thinks is very important, which is that voters get to vote on tax increases. I think what I would propose doing is you would change the second part of it, which restricts the growth of government even in incredible boon years where the economy is rising, right? And as you know, there are state costs that are rising faster than inflation, so that's not going to work. And so what that would allow you to do is say no tax increases, no new taxes, lesson I learned from Amendment 66, but to say we're just going to ask voters to allow the state budget to work the way your family budget works, which is on good years, you do better, you have some money there, you can save it for college or something else, or
Take
for
an
us, we can
extra
invest
trip,
in infrastructure and roads and bridges. And yeah, on tight years, we'll tighten the belt, but I think that would allow you to then have the stable revenue streams you could bond against, you could allocate, you could prioritize among those areas. But I think that, and it also allows you to build a broader coalition, which is not transportation on one measure and higher ed on one measure and K-12 on the other measure. It allows us to build a broader state coalition, which I think we'll need, given the challenges we've all seen in trying to pass statewide ballot measures.
And is that going to be enough, though? I mean, is that going to generate enough money to really ensure a stable stream of funding for both?
Well, I think what you do, I think the point is, I think it allows you a revenue stream to bond against, right? Because the challenge with some of the folks who weren't supportive of bonding was you don't know what the dedicated revenue stream is to pay off those bonds long term, and there's some fights about where they come from. So it's not to say that you're going to eat that entire elephant in one bite, but if you talk to the voters of the state and you said, all right, if you wanted to hit all those needs at once, you want to cover transportation, you want to cover K-12, you want to cover higher ed, you might be talking about $3.5 billion, $3 billion plus a year. I don't think there's any indication the voters of the state are ready to do that right now. And so I think this is a matter of what is the most urgent step right now, which is getting enough revenue in to solve the most critical challenges. And I think you could take a big chunk out of that with a deep-roofing measure.
As you look at bundling or coupling that education proponent with transportation, it really talks to the framework. And I think a lot of people look at policy in isolation or compartmentalized. Well, we understand it's a fabric, and these policies all interlay and affect each other. We're really talking a little bit about the economic development, the growth of the state of Colorado, where we're heading. Your education, the talent pipeline, our infrastructure, the workforce, and how these things lie together. I want to talk a little bit, certainly Amazon's made a lot of news. How do you look at economic development, especially in light of an individual that's toured the state with 66, the two different Colorados, and how do we support the non-front range, the east slope, or east plains, west slope of this state, and ensure that they're enjoying the same economic prosperity that many in the front range are doing?
I totally agree. I think this is a lesson probably I learned from being a parent as much as being a senator, which is, you know, I got three kids and they all need different things. And there's not an issue where they all need the same scenario. And so, yeah, do we need a whole lot of tax incentives to lure businesses from Grand Junction to Denver? No, probably not. But what you look at is there are parts of the state where we really want to be able to provide an incentive to encourage both businesses to grow in those regions and to move to those regions so that you have economic development in those more rural parts of the state. And so That was why I supported the Jumpstart legislation. That's why I think it's become a model for us and for the country, and why we want to do more of it. I think there are other things as well, right? We know we got to have high quality broadband in every county in the state, so folks that want to be engaged in a mobile economy can say, yeah, you can still live in Leadville or in Montrose, but telecommute to a company in Boulder or in Pensacola or wherever it might be. I think that becomes a huge issue. So it's about broadband. It's about the right incentives to grow businesses in those parts of the state that might look different in rural communities than urban ones. And then it's about making sure employees have the skills they need to enter the jobs that are coming.
There's been some pushback over the possibility of dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into Amazon as incentives here. People saying, well, maybe we should reconsider whether we give incentives to anyone at all to move to the Denver area at this point. How do you feel about that? Should we continue to help out companies that are looking to move to an area of great growth right now?
So I think for Amazon, the question for me, which is linked to this, is sort of like the question people ask when they say, should we bid for the Olympics or not? And the answer I say is, it depends, which is if you want to bid for the Olympics in a way that says, we want to use the money to build 18 new stadiums we don't need and leave them empty for the next 20 years, I would say no. If you want to do what places like Salt Lake did, which says you're going to bid for the Olympics and use it as an opportunity to actually build the infrastructure you needed to build anyway and leverage that event around it, that makes sense. And so for me, Amazon's the same, which is, do we want 50,000 more homes and incomes and employees in the state? Yes, absolutely. If we use it as a chance to step back and think, what would 50,000 more homes in the Denver metro area look like, and how would you make it possible to move people and services across these current infrastructure? I think that's going to call for us to step back and say that kind of step leap is going to require a real reanalysis of what we need on infrastructure and a new framework for it. So I do think we should incentivize folks to do that, but I think we got to make sure we're paying attention to the growth needs and the infrastructure needs while we do it. Obviously, given the choice, I think we'd rather incentivize businesses to go to places where there's less growth. So I think the Pueblos and the Grand Junctions and the San Luis Valleys, we'd love to see more economic development, but we know there are certain realities for some businesses, right? If you have to be on a plane 4 days a week, it's going to be hard for us to put you in Lamar. But if you're not in a business that's dependent on that, I think it'd be great for us to push people out of the metro area.
You had a chance, obviously, to attend the CU Leads economic forecast. They talked a little bit about the out-migration in this state and the pressures around housing and inventory and skyrocketing costs here in Colorado, cost of living, infrastructure challenges, workforce with certainly a low employment rate. As you look at the challenges around attainable, affordable worker housing issues, how do we crack that nut? How do we get the right kind of inventory at the right pricing so teachers that are up in Aspen and Vail can continue to live in the communities of where they're working, the people that are in hospitality are afforded those same opportunities?
I totally agree. This is one of the biggest, I think, crises the state faces, and it's one of the things I hear the most often all over the state. And I think the challenge with the current proposal, or what we've currently done, is we've said, listen, what you do is you have a private developer buy a tract of land at market value, build units at market value, and then apply for credits to try to reduce that rate. And there's not enough credits or cash in the state to be able to make that number of units possible. So our proposal is, I think the better way to go about this is to say there is an asset the state has that we can use, but it's not cash, it's land. Which is to say, if you enter the kind of public-private partnerships, as you know, when the state was created, right, 1/16 of the state of each section was led over to state land ownership, and then you have all the other public lands. You have public schools, community colleges, others. So our proposal would be, let the state contribute that public land as an asset to the deal. Let the private developers then take that land at, say, 10% of the market rate. You build 20 or 30 units on it with the agreement that those units stay on a 30 or 50-year lease that's affordable. And so that's a way you could make affordable for teachers, for nurses, for social workers, for firefighters, and you could use the state's asset in a really effective way, which is to control the price of housing.
And at this point, do you feel like we've done enough? I mean, you're again talking about land that the state has open. You're not talking about where a lot of people are already going into Denver, into Boulder, into Fort Collins, those areas. I mean, is there anything the state can do to further keep those prices from escalating, or is that a lost battle?
No, I actually think this is exactly the strategy you would use in urban areas as well as rural. So I think it is, you take an acre on the back of East High School in central Denver and say you're going to build 20 units on that spot, because a lot of these high schools might be sitting on 8-9 acres in a world where there aren't going to be 150 cars in the parking lot. You can now say, is there a different footprint you can use? So I think the elegance of this idea for us is you can use it in urban areas, rural areas, suburban areas. It's a matter of finding any acre of public land. And you talk to developers, they could find a lot of those spaces if you gave them, with the discount on land value, that makes the market incentive suddenly work enough that they can build it.
You know, one of the things as we start to shift into the conversation around energy policy, I want to tease this last segment a little bit. I had a chance to attend the COGCC hearing yesterday that was interesting. There's a lot of passion around energy policy, and you certainly put forth 100% renewable. Look forward to diving into that. Certainly, I think one of your opponents in this race has gotten a lot of traction because of his very public stances about that. But you were the first one to come out with that policy, and I think it's important for you to share that. So stay with us after the break as we dive into some energy policy with Mike Johnston.
Yeah, there's a great question for Mike Johnston, a Democratic candidate for governor, here on Finding Colorado's Next Governor on Connect and Collaborate. Stay with us. We have one more segment to go. Thanks so much for staying with us today on Connect and Collaborate as we are continuing our series of Finding Colorado's Next Governor. Today, the candidate we're talking to is Mike Johnston, Democrat.
Mike, as I teased before break, I remember spend some time on energy policy. Certainly, I serve on the Vital for Colorado board. We understand the importance of the extractive industry, fossil fuels to this state. But there's been an emergence, certainly in Colorado, with the bio and wind here in this state. You've stepped up and certainly put out there that you want to see us move toward 100% renewables, and certainly want to understand what an energy policy under a Johnston governorship would look like.
You bet. And to be clear, we're focused on the electric grid. So how do you get to a 100% renewable grid, which is you're still going to anticipate a lot of oil and gas and fleet vehicles and all other parts of the market. But I think this is a place where you can both stimulate the economy, grow jobs. Our projections are it's up to 50 to 60,000 jobs over the next 25 years to move towards renewables, compared to, say, the about 1,400 or so jobs that are in coal right now today. And you also decrease the costs of electricity to people. As we know now, you can even just watch the Excel filings to see wind and solar are often now less expensive than coal. So I think it drives down people's rates. It actually drives down people's health insurance premiums as you get fewer and fewer particulates in the air, and you create jobs. So I think and it puts us at the head of a really emerging economy, I think, in the state, and that's a big opportunity for Colorado. So I think we're ambitious about going there and think it's the right kind of man-on-the-moon goal to start with, and then build the research and development infrastructure you'll need to do things like battery storage that will be required to be able to get to that goal eventually. But I think obviously, in the this is a robust oil and gas state. I think there are a lot of folks in the industry who are doing really good work and focusing on expanding health and safety. I think that continues to be an additional focus I'm sure we'll talk about. But I think the question is both how do you set a long-term goal for Colorado, and how do you make sure that the current practices are focused on health and public safety while still protecting people's constitutional rights.
So for those oil and gas executives who are listening to this, who might say, "Wow, it sounds like he wants to run me out of business." I mean, how do you answer that and say, "No, I actually do respect the industry when I'm looking to go 100% renewable"?
I mean, again, I think clear our focus is on the electric grid. So there's no direct oil involvement in the electric grid. That's a separate industry. You're really talking about coal and you're talking about natural gas. And coal, I think, is an industry that we're going to see heading in decline for economic purposes, regardless of political ones, right? So I think that's already underway. And so I think that's the case is how do we make that transition meaningful? And that's why for us these policies connect. That's why we came out first with the Colorado Promise idea, which is how do you train and retrain workers at all stages of their career for that change. I think there will continue to be a robust oil and gas exploration community here in Colorado. I think what we know is whatever the timeline is, there is eventually going to become a point where you hit peak oil or reserves begin to run down, and we're going to want to have a long-term energy source here. So I think this makes Colorado's utility grid cleaner, but it doesn't say that you're not going to be able to still continue to harvest oil and gas for other uses, including fleet vehicles and the rest. I think what we'll see is, more and more people, I don't think GM is necessarily a tree hugger Greenpeace organization, but they've said they're going to move to all electric vehicles in their fleet over the next 5 to 10 years. So I think there may be industry changes that are coming. The private sector is going to lead on, but we want to make sure you can both grow jobs, grow the economy, and protect the environment. I think there's a way to do both of those.
There's been a lot of discussion. I want to take a quick step back, as you talked a little bit about retraining of those involved in the coal industry and ensuring that they have a path forward to continue to provide for their families. The autonomous vehicles and certainly its impact on the trucking industry is certainly going to be significant.
Yes, far more significant, I would argue.
Exactly. So what do you think about that retraining? What does that look like? How can a government and a Governor Johnston work on ensuring that those folks, again, have an opportunity for a meaningful career moving forward?
And I'm so glad you mentioned, because I don't think this became a debate about coal in the last year and a half, and really it is going to be about every industry, or many of them, over the next 10 to 15 years. So they'll just be the folks that lead for us. And this is why our focus on this idea of the Colorado Promise is about how do you get folks training and skill training at any stage of their career. So that truck driver could look out and say, okay, this job's going away. What are the jobs that are out there? Well, we got a huge demand for welders. We got a huge demand for nurses. We got a huge demand for coders, all real time. We got a huge demand for, financial services. Which of those feel like the right industry to me? What skills do I need? And the Colorado Promise would help them get access to that skills training regardless of what kind of income they have, so they know they could get the skills they need for the jobs that are coming. And I think the whole state's going to have to be prepared to make those kind of transitions over and over as industries change so quickly.
And I want to talk about one more thing before leaving the energy sector. You have been, unlike many in your party, coming out and saying, being very defensive, or not defensive, but at least defending the state's policy of overseeing oil and gas regulations versus local communities. Talk about where you think that balance lies, and where it would lie under Governor Johnston.
I think the state Supreme Court has been pretty clear about this, which is there are two sets of constitutionally protected rights here. There are folks that have property rights on the surface and folks that have property rights to the minerals underneath. And both of those rights are valid, and you have to defend them. So I don't think that you can ban someone's ability to get access to their own minerals. What I do think you can do is provide meaningful regulations that protect public health and safety so that you don't have those massive industrial drilling sites within 250 feet of a school or of a home. And so I think the benefits is a lot of the advances in technology that the oil and gas community is pioneering. When you can do a 2-mile horizontal drill that is as effective as 20 old vertical wells, that makes it more flexible for you to say, all right, I don't have to be 250 feet away from the school. I can move farther back. I can push on things like reducing the noise, the visibility, the traffic to and from these locations. And so I think there are ways in which there can be collaboration around a statewide set of regulations that probably require more focus on health and safety and more pushing back of the setbacks, but also establish some stability statewide around what those regulations would look like so that folks can do business and that people can go to and from home and school and know that they feel safe in their communities.
One of the things that business always talks about is a predictable environment, the certainty that's around, and that could be in the taxing code. It can certainly be in the labor and workforce. But one of the discussions that we've heard a lot about nationally under the current Trump regime is this regulatory rollback for business to continue to try and remove those impediments and roadblocks for business that want to continue to grow and expand. Yep. This state, we've had probably 7 straight years, the last one was a Neville bill, to try and roll back regulation on small biz and improve our ability to hang a shingle and be successful. How do you deal with the right balance of regulatory reform, Mike?
Yeah, I think my focus would be as governor is you want Colorado to be the best state in the country to do business. You want this to be the best place for folks to open a business, run a business, grow a business, because I think one of the best things you can give to anybody is a job, and so we want folks to be able to grow those and do that. And I do think having, owning a small business myself and having built a couple of nonprofits and a for-profit organizations, I know there are things that make your life really difficult and things that make your life easy. We want to decrease all the things that make your life difficult and see how you can make it easier for folks to innovate, to grow, to expand. There's nothing worse than running into a business owner who said, oh, I really wanted to grow this business here, and then I hit these obstacles that made it too hard, so I moved. I don't think any taxpayer wants to see that happen.
One of the things that businesses have been struggling for 15 years or so now are the rising costs of health insurance, healthcare costs rising in general. What is the role of the governor's office and the state government in stepping in and trying to halt those decreases in costs?
Yep, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and there are I think as a key role for the state to play in this. I think there are a couple things that I think are really important that the state can do. One is price transparency. How do you make it clearer to a consumer to know how much the cost of various services are, so they actually can know, when I take my dog to the vet, they'll tell you, here are the 3 services you might get, here's how much they each cost. When you take your kid to the hospital, you wait 2 weeks later and get a surprise bill in the mail and not sure what you got. And so I think that is a big first step. I think the second is you want to be able to guarantee choice for people in markets, and so you have Western Slope right now is one of the most expensive healthcare markets in the country right now because there's only one monopoly provider, so you don't have the choice to be able to make sure folks can choose among multiple providers and bring competition. So I think you want to bring competition, you want to bring choice. And the third is I think you want to move towards more of what we call value-based care, which is less of kind of fee-for-service medical provision and more of the insurance company and the patient have a shared interest in keeping me healthy. So if you say, hey, insurance company, we'll give you $10,000 a year to keep Mike healthy, If you can keep them healthy for $6,000 a year, great. You make the other $4,000 profit. So the aligned interests are, let's not wait until you come into the emergency room with a catastrophic need, you fall and break your hip or stop taking your medications, whatever that might be. How do you do more preventive-based work like the PACE programs around the state and others are doing to encourage us to keep costs down? A lot of the programs doing that are 30% or more below average cost of healthcare. So I think it's about transparency, it's about guaranteeing choice, and it's also about how you move towards more of this value-based care that drives down costs.
Mike, thank you for joining us today on this series with the Denver Business Journal, Finding Colorado's Next Governor. It's been an engaging conversation, fast-moving. We're at the end of the show, but we certainly want to give you, Mike, the opportunity to tell the listeners how to connect with you, how to find you, how to learn more about some of the ideas that you've been sharing with us today on air.
Oh, I so appreciate you all having me. It was a great conversation. Yeah, I would love to have folks learn more. Easy ways you can come to our website, which is MikeJohnstonForColorado.com. And I would just say, I think what I think you heard hopefully in this conversation is I am someone who above all is a problem solver who likes to figure out what are the things that we agree on and how do you bring folks from opposite sides together to get those big things done. And I think that's the spirit Colorado's had for 150 years. We want to have for the next 150, but there are some big problems and the state's got to solve, from healthcare to economy to transportation. And I think the next governor is going to have to be someone who has the courage to take on those really big problems and to cross the divides that exist in the country right now. It's got the humility to listen to people on both sides once you get there, and then the conviction to act on things that are hard. And I think that's been my history from my work as a school teacher in Mississippi to a school principal to a state senator, is the willingness to both cross those divides, take on the hardest problems, and get folks to work together to get them done. So I'd love to have folks support to do that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much, Mike Johnston, Democratic candidate for governor, here on Finding Colorado's Next Governor. And thank you to Jeff Wasden and Ed Seelever from the Denver Business Journal as well. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining.